In the winter of 1959, the lobby of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach hummed with the quiet confidence of American prosperity. Waiters moved between velvet chairs, carrying glasses of bourbon. Politicians laughed beside wealthy businessmen. And somewhere in the room, usually seated quietly in the corner, was a small, sharply dressed man with calm eyes and an almost invisible presence. He was not loud. He did not command attention. Most people in that lobby would have walked past him without a second glance. But the men who truly understood power in America knew exactly who he was. His name was Meyer Lansky. To the public, he was a successful investor, a quiet financial consultant, a man connected to hotels, casinos, and various respectable businesses across the country. But inside the hidden world of organized crime, Meyer Lansky carried a very different reputation. He was the accountant of the American Mafia, the strategist behind some of the most profitable criminal enterprises in modern history. A man who helped build the financial system that allowed organized crime to flourish across the United States. And unlike many of the gangsters whose stories filled newspaper headlines, Meyer Lansky almost never went to prison. He did not carry a gun in public. He did not run street crews. Instead, he built something far more powerful. He built systems. But to understand how Meyer Lansky became one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime, the story begins decades earlier. Far from Miami Beach, far from casinos and politicians. It begins in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of New York City. In the spring of 1902, in the city of Grodno in the Russian Empire, a place that today sits within modern Belarus, a boy named Meyer Lansky was born into a Jewish family struggling under the harsh realities of Eastern Europe. Life for Jewish families in the Russian Empire was filled with uncertainty. Anti-Jewish violence, government restrictions, and economic hardship forced many families to look westward toward a new future. By 1911, the Lansky family made the same decision thousands of others had made. They left. After a long and difficult journey across the Atlantic, the family arrived in New York City and settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the most densely populated immigrant neighborhoods in the world. The streets were crowded with pushcar vendors, factories, and cramped tenement buildings. Languages from every corner of Europe echoed through the narrow streets. Italian, Yiddish, Russian, Polish. For young Meyer, who would later adopt the name Meyer Lansky, the Lower East Side was both a harsh environment and an education. It was a place where children learned quickly how the world worked. And sometimes, survival meant bending the rules. During the early years of the 20th century, New York's Lower East Side was also becoming something else. It was becoming the birthplace of modern American organized crime. Street gangs formed among immigrant youth. Small groups controlled gambling operations, protection rackets, and petty theft. For a young boy growing up in the neighborhood, crime was not some distant concept. It was part of the street economy, and Meyer Lansky was watching closely. Unlike many of the other boys who drifted toward gang life, Lansky was known for something unusual. He was extremely intelligent. Teachers who encountered him often noted his sharp memory and quick understanding of numbers. Mathematics came naturally to him. He could calculate odds, percentages, and profits almost instinctively. That talent would eventually make him one of the most valuable men in organized crime. But first, he needed partners. And one of the most important partnerships in American criminal history began during those early years on the Lower East Side. Around 1918, Lansky met another young immigrant who was also trying to survive in the streets of New York. His name was Benjamin Siegel. Most people would later know him by a different name, Bugsy Siegel. Where Lansky was quiet and calculating, Siegel was charismatic, unpredictable, and often violent. He carried himself with confidence and ambition, even as a teenager. The two young men could not have been more different, but together, they formed something powerful. Their early activities were relatively small. They ran protection rackets, targeting pushcart vendors. They operated illegal gambling games. They intimidated rival street gangs. But even in those early years, Lansky approached crime differently. He saw it as a business. While others focused on short-term money, Lansky studied organization. He believed criminal enterprises could operate with the same structure and discipline as legitimate corporations. And he quickly realized something else. The future of organized crime would not belong to small neighborhood gangs. It would belong to alliances. During the early 1920s, another young man began making a name for himself in the criminal world of New York. His name was Charles Luciano. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, Luciano had arrived in America as a child and grown up in the same Lower East Side streets that shaped Lansky. Luciano possessed something rare. He understood both worlds. He had connections inside the Italian Mafia, the traditional Sicilian crime families that controlled much of the criminal activity among Italian immigrants. But he also believed those old traditions were outdated. Luciano wanted to build something new, something modern. And when Luciano met Meyer Lansky, he found someone who understood that vision. Their partnership would change the structure of organized crime in America forever. By the mid-1920s, Lansky, Siegel, and Luciano had begun forming alliances across ethnic lines, something that traditional mafia leaders strongly opposed. Italian gangsters worked with Jewish gangsters. Irish criminals cooperated with Sicilian mobsters. To the old world bosses, it was unacceptable. But to Lansky and Luciano, it was the future. And the opportunity that would accelerate their rise came in 1920 with a single government decision. Prohibition. When the United States government banned the production and sale of alcohol, it unintentionally created one of the largest black markets in American history. Demand for alcohol did not disappear. Instead, it exploded. Speakeasies opened across major cities. Smugglers moved liquor across the Canadian border. Organized crime groups began controlling distribution networks worth millions of dollars. For ambitious young criminals like Lansky and Luciano, prohibition was not just an opportunity. It was a revolution. Bootlegging operations spread across New York City, Chicago, Detroit, and beyond. Trucks filled with illegal whiskey moved through the night. Police officers were bribed. Politicians quietly accepted campaign donations. And behind many of those operations were men like Meyer Lansky. But even as profits soared, the criminal underworld was becoming increasingly dangerous. Old mafia bosses resisted change. Rival gangs fought for territory. And by the late 1920s, tensions inside New York's criminal world were reaching a breaking point. What followed would become known as the Castellammarese War, a brutal internal conflict that reshaped the mafia forever. Murder spread across New York. Powerful crime bosses turned on each other. And behind the scenes, Meyer Lansky was already thinking several moves ahead. Because Lansky understood something that many of the older mafia leaders did not. Violence might build empires, but intelligence would control them. And soon, one carefully planned decision would change the balance of power inside the American underworld forever. Part 2. The business of crime in the autumn of 1930. The streets of New York City had grown tense with suspicion and quiet fear. Murders tied to organized crime were appearing in newspapers with unsettling regularity. Bodies were discovered in alleyways, parked cars, and abandoned buildings. Each killing seemed to carry a message meant for someone else in the criminal world. The violence was part of a larger conflict unfolding behind closed doors. Historians would later call it the Castellammarese War. It was not simply a gang war. It was a struggle over the future of organized crime in America. On one side stood the old Sicilian bosses, men who believed power should remain inside tightly controlled ethnic hierarchies. These leaders followed traditions brought from Sicily, strict codes of loyalty, rigid leadership structures, and an almost religious devotion to old world customs. On the other side were younger men like Charles Luciano, men who had grown up in America and understood that the criminal world was changing. They believed organized crime needed to evolve into something larger, more efficient, and more profitable. And standing quietly beside Luciano during those years was Meyer Lansky. Unlike many gangsters involved in the conflict, Lansky rarely appeared in the violence itself. He did not command armies of gunmen or engage in public displays of power. Instead, he advised. He calculated. He studied the balance of power with the patience of a chess player. One evening in early 1931, inside a private meeting between Luciano and Lansky, a decision was made that would change everything. Luciano's own boss, the powerful mafia leader Giuseppe Masuria, had become a major obstacle to modernization. Masuria represented the old guard, the traditional structure that Luciano believed had to disappear if organized crime was going to evolve. Luciano hesitated at first. Turning against his own boss was an act that carried enormous risk. But Lansky saw the situation differently. He believed the war would continue endlessly unless someone made a decisive move. And so a plan was set in motion. On April 15, 1931, Masuria arrived at a small restaurant in Coney Island called Nuova Villa Tomorrow. He believed he was meeting Luciano for lunch. For a while, everything appeared normal. The two men sat at a table and ate together. They talked quietly. At one point, Luciano excused himself and stepped outside. Moments later, gunmen entered the restaurant. When the shooting stopped, Giuseppe Masuria was dead. The Castellammarese War was effectively over. But what followed was even more important. Luciano moved quickly to dismantle the old system of mafia leadership and replace it with something entirely new. Instead of one supreme boss controlling everything, power would now be shared among several organized crime families. Decisions affecting the entire underworld would be made collectively through a governing body that came to be known as the Commission. It was, in many ways, the corporate boardroom of American organized crime, and Meyer Lansky helped design it. The structure brought stability to a world that had previously been ruled by constant violence. Conflicts between crime families could now be negotiated rather than settled through endless killings. But Lansky's greatest contribution to the new criminal order was not organizational. It was financial. While many gangsters focused on territory and influence, Lansky focused on money. He understood that illegal gambling, if managed correctly, could produce enormous profits without the attention that violent crimes attracted. During the early 1930s, Lansky began developing a network of gambling operations across New York and other major cities. Card rooms, horse betting operations, dice games. Each operation was structured carefully, with trusted managers, clear accounting systems, and disciplined enforcement. Unlike chaotic street-level gambling rings, Lansky's operations ran almost like legitimate businesses. Money flowed steadily, and the profits were enormous. But Lansky's ambitions extended far beyond New York. By the mid-1930s, he had begun exploring opportunities in another location, a place where gambling laws were more flexible and political influence could open doors that were closed in the United States. That place was Cuba. At the time, Havana was becoming a playground for wealthy Americans. Tourists arrived by ship and airplane looking for nightlife, alcohol, and entertainment that had once been restricted during Prohibition. Lansky quickly recognized the potential. With the right political connections, Havana could become one of the most profitable gambling centers in the world. And Lansky knew exactly who to approach: Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a rising political figure in Cuba who would soon become the country's most powerful leader. Like many politicians of the era, Batista understood the value of foreign investment. Lansky presented an attractive proposition. American money would flow into Cuba to build luxury casinos and hotels. Tourism would increase. Profits would benefit both the criminal investors and the Cuban political leadership. It was a partnership that proved extremely lucrative. Throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, Lansky helped establish several major casino operations in Havana. Wealthy visitors from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles arrived in increasing numbers, eager to experience the glamorous nightlife that Havana offered. Roulette wheels spun late into the night, blackjack tables filled with wealthy gamblers. And behind the scenes, a carefully organized financial system ensured that the house always won. But Cuba was only one piece of Lansky's growing empire. Another opportunity was developing inside the United States, in the Nevada desert. During the early 1940s, the small city of Las Vegas was beginning to transform. Nevada had legalized gambling, and investors were slowly building casinos along a dusty highway that would later become known as the Las Vegas Strip. One of the most ambitious projects was a new luxury casino resort called the Flamingo. The man responsible for developing it was Lansky's longtime associate, Bugsy Siegel. Siegel envisioned the Flamingo as something entirely new, a glamorous resort that would attract Hollywood celebrities, wealthy gamblers, and international tourists. But the project quickly spiraled out of control. Construction costs soared. Deadlines passed. Investors grew increasingly nervous. Behind the scenes, many of those investors were connected to organized crime syndicates that expected quick returns on their money. Lansky watched the situation carefully. He had known Siegel since their teenage years on the Lower East Side. Their partnership had survived decades of criminal activity. But now, millions of dollars were at stake. When the Flamingo finally opened in December 1946, it was a disaster. The hotel rooms were unfinished. The casino struggled to attract customers. Financial losses mounted quickly. For the syndicate investors, patience was running out. And in the summer of 1947, Bugsy Siegel was sitting inside the Beverly Hills home of his girlfriend when gunfire shattered the windows. Siegel died instantly. Officially, the murder was never solved. But in the world of organized crime, many believe the decision had been approved by the same syndicate leadership that Lansky had helped build years earlier. The Flamingo, however, would eventually become a success, and Las Vegas would soon evolve into one of the most profitable gambling centers in the world. But by the late 1940s, another problem had begun attracting attention: the United States government. For decades, organized crime had operated largely in the shadows. But after World War II, federal investigators began focusing more closely on the expanding influence of criminal syndicates. Senators launched investigations. Newspaper headlines exposed hidden connections between politicians, unions, and organized crime figures. And slowly, the quiet financial empire that Meyer Lansky had built began drawing unwanted attention. For the first time in many years, the man who had spent decades operating behind the scenes was beginning to appear in the public eye. And law enforcement was finally starting to ask the same question: who exactly was Meyer Lansky? And how much power did he really control? Part 3. The man who stayed free in the spring of 1950, a quiet but historic investigation began inside the United States Senate. For decades, rumors about organized crime had circulated through American cities. Newspapers occasionally reported gangland murders. Police departments investigated illegal gambling and bootlegging operations. But few people truly understood how large and sophisticated these criminal networks had become. That changed when Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee launched a nationwide investigation into organized crime. The hearings, later known as the Kefauver Committee, became one of the first major public examinations of the American Mafia and its growing influence across the country. For the first time, Americans watched gangsters testify on national television. Smoke-filled committee rooms turned into a national stage. Witnesses nervously answered questions under bright lights, while millions of viewers listened from their living rooms. The hearings exposed a hidden world of gambling operations, bribery, political corruption, and interstate criminal cooperation. And sooner or later, the investigation began circling a name that had quietly appeared behind many of these operations: Meyer Lansky. Unlike some of the more flamboyant gangsters who testified openly, Lansky did everything possible to avoid appearing before the committee. He rarely spoke to reporters. He avoided public confrontations. But federal investigators had already begun assembling a picture of his role in organized crime. They saw him not as a street gangster, but as something more dangerous: a financial architect. Throughout the 1940s and early 1950s, Lansky had quietly developed sophisticated methods for moving and hiding money generated by illegal operations. Profits from gambling houses, casinos, and other rackets flowed through complex networks of shell companies, foreign bank accounts, and legitimate businesses. At a time when most criminal groups still relied on cash hidden in safes or buried in fields, Lansky was already exploring international financial systems. Some investigators would later describe him as one of the earliest pioneers of modern money laundering, but proving it was extraordinarily difficult. Unlike many organized crime figures, Lansky rarely left direct evidence behind. He avoided signing documents, kept his name off official records, and allowed trusted associates to handle public-facing business deals. To law enforcement officials, it was like chasing a ghost. During the 1950s, however, federal pressure on organized crime continued to increase. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, began expanding its surveillance of suspected mob leaders. Informants provided new intelligence about criminal syndicates operating across multiple states. Slowly, the government began building cases. And while Lansky had managed to stay largely invisible for decades, the attention was beginning to tighten around him. But another major threat to his empire was developing far beyond Washington. In Cuba, Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Lansky had helped transform Havana into one of the most glamorous gambling destinations in the Western Hemisphere. Luxury casinos operated inside grand hotels overlooking the ocean. Wealthy American tourists filled the gaming tables. Behind many of those casinos stood partnerships between organized crime investors and Cuban political officials. And for years, the system worked perfectly, until the revolution came. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces successfully overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista. Almost overnight, the political landscape of Cuba changed completely. The new revolutionary government viewed the casino industry not as a symbol of prosperity, but as evidence of corruption and foreign exploitation. Within months, Castro's government shut down Havana's casinos. Many were seized by the state. Some were destroyed. For Meyer Lansky, the loss was enormous. Millions of dollars invested in Cuban casinos vanished almost instantly. One of the most profitable centers of his gambling empire disappeared overnight. And for the first time in decades, Lansky faced a serious financial setback. But even as his Cuban operations collapsed, another battle was beginning inside the United States. Federal prosecutors were now determined to bring charges against him. In the early 1970s, after years of investigation, the U.S. government accused Lansky of tax evasion, the same charge that had famously sent Al Capone to prison decades earlier. Facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, Lansky made a surprising decision. In 1970, he left the United States and traveled to Israel. Under Israel's law of return, Jews from around the world were allowed to immigrate and claim citizenship. Lansky hoped the law would protect him from extradition and allow him to live out his remaining years beyond the reach of American prosecutors. For a brief moment, it appeared the plan might work. Lansky settled in a life in Israel and applied for permanent residency. But Israeli authorities faced intense pressure from the United States government. Officials worried that allowing a famous organized crime figure to remain in the country would damage Israel's international reputation. After months of legal debate, the Israeli government rejected Lansky's request. He was ordered to leave. In November 1972, Meyer Lansky was deported back to the United States. Federal prosecutors immediately prepared their case. But once again, the quiet strategist who had spent decades avoiding prison proved difficult to convict. The government struggled to prove that Lansky directly controlled the financial networks they suspected. Key witnesses refused to testify. Evidence was incomplete. In 1974, after a lengthy legal process, the case against him collapsed. Meyer Lansky walked free. By then, however, he was already an old man. The criminal empire he had helped build during the early 20th century was changing rapidly. Law enforcement tactics had improved. Organized crime families faced increasing legal pressure. And many of the men who had shaped the Mafia's golden age were already gone. Charles "Lucky" Luciano had died in 1962. Bugsy Siegel had been murdered decades earlier. Others had been imprisoned or faded into obscurity. Lansky himself spent his final years living quietly in Miami Beach. Neighbors often described him as polite, reserved, and unremarkable. Few people who saw the elderly man walking along the streets of Miami would have guessed that he had once helped design one of the most powerful criminal networks in American history. On January 15, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer at the age of 80. In the years after his death, legends about his fortune continued to circulate. Some believed he had hidden hundreds of millions of dollars in secret accounts across the world. Others claimed the money had long since disappeared through failed investments and legal expenses. When investigators examined his estate, they found surprisingly little. The man, often described as the financial genius of organized crime, appeared to have died with only modest wealth. But the true measure of Meyer Lansky's influence was never just money. It was the system he helped create. Before Lansky and his partners, organized crime in America had been fragmented and chaotic, dominated by local gangs constantly fighting for territory. After Lansky, it became something different. A national network, structured, coordinated, connected through alliances that crossed cities, states, and even international borders. And while many of the gangsters who gained fame through violence became household names, Meyer Lansky remains something else entirely. The man in the background, the strategist, the quiet architect of an empire most people never fully saw. Even today, historians and investigators continue to debate the true scale of his influence. Because in the world of organized crime, the most powerful figures are not always the ones who make the most noise. Sometimes, the most dangerous man in a room is the one who says almost nothing at all.